Welcome to the second installment of what we're calling the extra webinar session that is brought to you by the Community Foundation for the Land of Lincoln through our project, The Next 10. This topic today will be investing in the creative economy, and we're going to be hearing from people near and far about the creative economy through the arts, entertainment, and so forth. So I'm so happy today to have these great group of panelists that I'll let Jamie introduce in a little bit. But first, I thought I'd give you a brief update on where we're at with the Next 10 project. As we last spoke, I mentioned that we are sorting through hundreds of ideas that were submitted by citizens around the Springfield area, and we continue to do so. Our Next 10 steering committee did have a session, a workshop to really sort through the nearly 600 ideas that have been submitted. And now we're constantly on the phone, emailing, texting people to figure out how we're going to get a lot of stuff done. So it's very exciting, very dynamic, and we are so grateful to all the ideas that keep coming, quite honestly. Had someone stop me in the supermarket yesterday saying, hey, is it still time to give ideas? And I said, there's always room for good ideas. So know that we're hard at work and hope to have an announcement here in a couple months with the projects we hope to pursue, at least the first set of projects we hope to pursue. I'm going to introduce Jamie Giellis to introduce the rest of the speakers, and I want to say thank you to all of them on behalf of myself and the Community Foundation. But I'm especially excited to see a couple of people on the panel today that I've known for, can't believe it, over 30 years now. So Sheila Walk, who's a local Springfieldian, and you may recognize the last name Langfelder for Jacob Langfelder, who no longer lives in Springfield, but I think we all know that name around here. So especially to those two, I appreciate you coming on today. I know all the panelists are going to be fantastic, and it'll be a great conversation led by what I'm calling our adopted Springfieldian, Jamie Giellis. Jamie's the lead consultant on the Next 10 project, and she also has just such a rich history in her own career of working in arts organizations. So with that, Jamie, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, John. And thank you again to all the panelists and for the participants joining us today. Really looking forward to an exciting conversation about investing in the creative economy. A number of the ideas that came in through the Next 10 website were focused in some way on art or culture or history or how we really celebrate and enliven the creative economy of Springfield, which you are all so very proud of the wonderful assets you have there. And I think there's really a desire to continue to grow and build on those. So I'm really excited to have the panel together that we have today. I'm gonna have them introduce themselves one by one here in just a moment because they represent quite diverse backgrounds and insights, and we're going to cover a lot of territory related to the creative economy today. And as I've told all the panelists, try to tie it together in a neat little bow by the end, but we're going to be talking about a lot of different topics over the next hour and a half. Just a couple housekeeping things real quick. There is a Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please feel free to send in questions at any time. We do have a number of questions we'll be giving to the panelists, but I'll be keeping my eye on that Q&A box and certainly weaving in any questions that we can fit in over the next hour and a half as well. And I also just want to let you know that this session is being recorded, and later today it should be available on the Next 10 website as well as on social media. So if you have others you want to share it with, you'll be able to do that as well. So let's jump in. And the first thing I want to do is just go around the Zoom room and have everybody just briefly introduce themselves, who they are, who they're with, and where they're at today, because we have panelists joining in from all over the country. So I'm going to start with Justin Croft.
Thank you, Jamie, and really appreciate the chance to speak with you all. My name is Justin Croft. I am the Vice President of Development with Zeppelin Development. We are based in Denver. We've been engaging in creative placemaking and creative real estate development in Denver for 40 years. We've been primarily working in what have historically been overlooked urban core neighborhoods, starting back in the 80s, including Lower Downtown and the River North Art District, which I'm sure we'll be talking a little bit more about later today. I have a background in urban planning. I'm also I have been an on again, off again, semi-professional musician for most of my life. And so I really have been tied into the creative communities in Denver for a long time. And I also chaired the River North Business Improvement District and actually chaired the steering committee to form it. So placemaking is really in my blood. It's very much the ethos of the company that I work for. And so I'm excited to talk with you all today.
Great. Thanks, Justin. Mike.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. And John, thank you for hosting this. I'm Mike Devine. I'm with Gallagher and Associates. We are a museum planning and design firm. I'm president of Gallagher Museum Services, which is the strategy and business planning arm of the firm. We're headquartered out of DC, have offices in New York and Portland, Oregon, and then satellite places all around the country. I'm actually based out of Cleveland, Ohio, and happy to join everybody and look forward to the conversation today. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Wendy, and I'll let you introduce Anna as well.
Wonderful. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Wendy Holmes with Artspace, and Artspace is based in Minneapolis. So I'm in my bedroom in my condo near downtown Minneapolis and clashing with my bedspread, but pardon that. Artspace is a nonprofit. We're based all across we're based in Minneapolis, but we work all across the country. Our mission is to create, foster, and preserve long-term affordable space for artists and arts organizations, and we own 54 projects and communities of artists across the country, including 2 of the cities represented on this call, New York City and Denver. And then I'm going to turn it over to Anna to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Anna, and I work with Wendy at Artspace, and my focus at Artspace is really programming around training and capacity building for arts nonprofits and creative businesses.
Great. Thanks so much, Wendy and Anna. Jacob, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, my name is Jacob Langfelder. I am born and raised Springfield, Illinois. I'm coming to you from New York City, where I've lived for about 20 years now. Recently, a few years ago, I started splitting my time between Napa. I'm a producer, Broadway, concerts, live events, festivals, in both the nonprofit and commercial arenas, varying anything from culinary arts to dance and music.
Great. Thanks, Jacob. And last but certainly not least, Sheila.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sheila. I was raised on a family farm in East Central Illinois. Then I came to Springfield and taught at a wonderful school, Ursuline Academy, on the north end of Springfield for 30 years, speech and theater, literature and composition. And now I'm the executive director of the Springfield Area Arts Council. I'm sitting in my office at the Hoagland Center for the Arts downtown. And the logo that you see beside me is a national poetry recitation contest. The Springfield Area Arts Council manages the Central Illinois Regional, which is happening this week virtually, and the Illinois State Contest, with the state champion moving on to a virtual contest typically held in Washington, D.C. later in the spring. It's called Poetry Out Loud. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks so much, Sheila, and everybody for your introductions. And we're going to dive right in. And I'm going to go back to Sheila for our first question so we can start local and then sort of expand out from there. So Sheila, my first question for you is, could you talk a little bit about the state of the local arts economy, the local arts scene in Springfield, maybe touch on some post-COVID realities that the arts world is facing, and also just kind of high level opportunities you see immediately to strengthen Springfield's creative economy?
Yes, thank you, Jamie. I'm going to start with a quote from Randy Cohen. He is a researcher at the national level in the arts and culture field. And he says, no, I'm going to do this differently. I'm going to start with a quote from a New York Times article in January of this year, just last month, that sets sort of a national sense of how the pandemic has impacted performers and artists. So from the New York Times, January, professional creative artists are facing unemployment rates well above the national average. More than 52% of actors, 55% of dancers were out of work in the third quarter of 2020 at a time when the national unemployment rate was 8.5%. Several hundred independent music venues have closed. Art galleries and dance companies have shuttered. Painters and performers weep over canceled shows and tours, salivate over more generous government support in Europe or Asia, and ask themselves if 2021 is the year to abandon their careers. So that's the pessimistic side of this, and it is true. The pandemic has impacted this sector greatly. An Americans for the Arts survey found that 95% of creative workers reported a loss of income due to the pandemic at a national level. Locally, visual artists have had to find alternate outlets for their work when the galleries in which they typically show and sell have closed. Musicians mostly have no work, either because no one is hiring them in the closed venues or because of their own need to safeguard their and their family's health. Some are streaming their performances, but not much income results from that, having staged a virtual fundraiser at the end of last year, I know. For some performers and visual artists, this kind of stress has stifled their creativity. For others, though, it has increased their productivity, partly because they have perhaps increased available time. For all creative workers, they have engaged in creative problem solving. I've had to learn different licensing requirements for streaming music. I fear that some venues that we typically produce concert series in will not reopen, or that it won't yet be safe for our summer series. 2 of our annual fundraisers were COVID canceled. There's limited sponsorship revenue for virtual events. Local businesses are our usual sponsors. They have no money to spare. Some programs are grant funded. If there's no program, because of the pandemic, there's no grant, so no 10% off the top for administration. But overall, factoring in all of that, the Springfield Area Arts Council in 2020 only suffered an 11% decrease in revenue. And I think that's remarkable. Our staff is working remarkable. Communication's a little more challenging. They're working remotely, so communication has been a bit more difficult. An assistant here chose remote work, but doesn't have the needed software to execute some of the tasks. The bookkeeper is leaving our employ to focus on childcare. More of my time is devoted to fundraising, but all in all, our members have stepped up, so that revenue has remained steady. There have been more avenues for general operating support. The Community Foundation certainly has been a great partner in finding that. There's been more engagement among the performers that we typically employ in a calendar year. And in Springfield, I've been impressed with the creativity of other arts organizations. The Legacy Theater had torch songs, the Ghost Light at center stage, and solo performers coming in to perform Broadway classics on an otherwise dark and empty stage. The Springfield Theater Center this very weekend coming up has something called Quarantine, teenagers performing virtually. The Hoagland Center had a virtual gala and has been hard at work on some of the infrastructure improvements of the building. The Springfield Art Association for Valentine's Day put forward blind date with a book. They would give you only the first few lines of a book, and then you would come and pick up chocolates from a local maker and the book, and then curl up and read for Valentine's weekend. Barbershop choruses have been having virtual rehearsals and producing YouTube videos. The Garvey Tubman Center has placed artist-designed Black History billboards in neighborhoods on the east side of Springfield. The Illinois Symphony Orchestra, Sundays at 6 recital series virtually. The ballet company, since they couldn't perform the Nutcracker as is traditional in December, produced a wonderful documentary called Through Clara's Eyes, talking with and seeing the performances of past Claras in their production. For the Arts Council itself, we had a virtual First Night Springfield, now engaged in virtual poetry out loud. We started a new series called Creators of Art, Music, and Poetry, featuring our local talent. So all of that, I think, is quite optimistic. Now I'll close with this quote from Randy Cohen and give someone else the floor. Again, he's a researcher at the national level of arts and culture initiatives. When we get to the other side of the pandemic, I believe the arts will be among our greatest assets in helping the nation to recover. The arts are kindling for the economy, small investments that deliver big returns. The arts also provide shared and meaningful experiences in public spaces, a community connection that heals the loneliness caused by isolation and safe distancing. The arts are on the right side of what needs to be done to rebuild and heal our country.
Great. Thank you so much, Sheila, for that wonderful overview of all of the good that is coming out even in this tough time. I want to ask Justin to step in here and talk a little bit about what you see as opportunities for communities like Springfield to really thrive as an artist enclave. What does it look like for the creative economy to lead, to Sheila's point? Particularly coming out of a time like the pandemic. And I think certainly your work through Zeppelin, through RiNo, you've been, coming out of the recession in 2008, for example, we really saw arts be catalytic for placemaking and community development. So talk a little bit about your experiences and what you see as real opportunities in this moment and going forward.
Thanks, Jamie. So yeah, art and kind of like I mentioned earlier, creative placemaking has been kind of undergirded all of our efforts as a development company for a long time. And that's not particularly typical in real estate development, but it's given us an interesting perspective on where arts and the economy can really align. I think just to go right at the question, I think a lot of what can create success for the arts in ultimately driving regeneration and economic development has to do with partnership. So to the degree that the municipality, the arts community, and the development community can get on the same page on what the high level goals are and what the needs are of each so that they can be aligned, that tends to be really the starting point for where we've seen success. Now, certainly, we've also been able to go it alone in a lot of cases where we've created developments. We're just utilizing the existing entitlements and really creating spaces that are usually mixed use. For example, in the 1980s in Lower Downtown, which if you've never been to Denver, is kind of Denver's original warehouse district. It's a brick warehouse district. In the 80s was really Skid Row. And one of the first things that Mickey Zeppelin built while he was doing some loft conversions down there was a architectural bookstore and cafe called City Spirit. And City Spirit really became the gathering place. And so in a sense, you had a developer who had the ability to create the physical space and had the capital to create the physical space, but really cared about the arts community, invited the arts community in, and made sure that that space represented their values, created a place for kind of creative collisions. And so out of that, you had this partnership working back and forth between the arts and artists and a developer. And really that has continued over time. For example, one of our most recent buildings is a 140,000 foot creative office building that also, we have one tenant in there that takes almost 100,000 feet of that building. That's also doing some research and development in there as well. So it's got a very light industrial component, but we carved off a couple thousand square feet and it's an artist in residence space. And so we have artists that are coming in every month to 2 months. They're living in an apartment that we built on site in a separate building, and they're just creating in that space. And so sort of this mixture of uses is really important. I think too, where we've had success both as a developer, but I'll just kind of put my other hat on, which is more taking kind of a civic view of this or a community building view, is leveraging existing assets that you know that creatives will be able to utilize and are looking for. And so some things that we had in the River North District, which is really kind of where Zeppelin's been over the last 10 years and where I've done a lot of work. It's kind of, you can think of it as the second warehouse district in Denver. It's about a mile outside of the downtown core. And its heyday was really in kind of the middle part of the 20th century. So what we had in that space was we had an interesting built environment, which an interesting built environment sparks creativity. There's a reason that creatives are drawn to those spaces. It had flexible space and that it had a lot of former commercial and former industrial. That space was inexpensive because it had been overlooked for a long time and wasn't at that point an economic center. And so there was the ability to kind of create and form that critical mass of creatives who were drawn to that space. And I think looking at Springfield and how can it leverage its existing assets, it has a lot of the same things. I mean, the ability to take commercial space that's maybe not being fully utilized right now, make that attractive for artists. The proximity to expensive urban centers where there's already kind of a dense cultural community in St. Louis and Chicago. And then the other thing is that there's a particular advantage right now in taking advantage of the trend towards decentralization. And that has a lot to do with COVID, but that trend had already begun. Quality of life, I think, is viewed as key. And cities with their incredible sort of explosion of life and culture and economy over the last 20 years have really started to leave a lot of people behind. So what artists are looking for is they still want that critical mass of community, but they want to be able to buy a house and have a yard and have pets and not necessarily be constrained to having to get the smallest apartment in Chicago because that's all they can afford on an artist's income. There are a couple of good examples I just want to throw out, and I'll close with this. One is the town of Trinidad in Colorado, and Jamie, I know you've done some work in Trinidad. But Trinidad is a small and has historically been kind of a down and out former coal mining town. One of its greatest assets has been its downtown environment, which is all of these really beautiful brick buildings. There, over the last 5 years, has been a slow and growing exodus of artists who are looking for less expensive space. They're moving from Denver and other areas of Colorado towards Trinidad because the built environment in being built in this kind of around a commercial core, it lays the foundation for a community. And the fact that space is not as expensive means that they can afford to live kind of in that communal environment. I'll talk a little bit later about the ways that as a starting point can really become something to build on economically. But I think this example of Trinidad really provides a little bit of a roadmap. There are some differences, but showing how creatives want to live in smaller towns where they can both be together and afford space.
Thanks, Justin. And I just want to ask, we had a question come in while you were talking specifically about the economics of the project you were talking about where you have the artist in residence. And so the question is about how is the artist space free? How is the artist funded? Is there a stipend? Do they live for free? Can you just give a quick overview of how that program has worked for you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the opportunities that as a long-term hold developer, we're able to identify because we're sort of looking at the economic performance of these buildings in the long term. And when you have a building that's 140,000 square feet, 1,500 square feet of artist in residence space, you can write that into your pro forma as free space, and the building, the model still performs really well. So yes, that space is free. It's also some of the premium space in the building. It's on the ground floor at the facade. It faces the South Platte River, which is the major river in Denver. And it's just a really kind of inviting space for creatives. Similarly, we built an apartment building next door to it. And that apartment building is large enough that we, again, wrote in one of the units as not needing to generate income, but really being set aside specifically for creatives. So that is how we're able to offer both the live space and the workspace at no cost to the artists.
Awesome, thanks. And that's a great transition over to Wendy to talk about live and workspace for artists, which Artspace has really carved a unique niche nationally and in making space for artists that allows them to stay even as neighborhoods change and sometimes get more expensive. So please share a little bit more about how you guys do your work, the benefits of clustering those artists' work-live spaces together, what you see out of that. And then maybe, Wendy, if you could also just touch on one of the questions that's come in from our viewers is about experience dealing with historic preservation laws. And I know you guys have worked in places where, you've taken old buildings and perhaps there's a historic preservation issues around that. So if you could just touch on that too while you talk, that'd be great.
Absolutely. I forgot to say that I grew up in Central Illinois. So for those of you who are tuning in, I'm a hometown person and I grew up near Peoria, Illinois. So on a farm. Sheila, we can talk sometime. I love coming after Justin because Artspace and Zeppelin have a very symbiotic relationship and an approach. We just completed a project in Trinidad, Colorado, where Justin was talking about. It's a 41 unit live work project, affordable for artists, and affordable meaning for people who are between 30 and 60% of area median income for that area. And so it is easier to work in smaller communities in terms of land cost and building costs. There's no question about that. So that's just a given. In Springfield, it's going to be easier to create long-term affordable space for the creative sector than it is in Manhattan. Although we did it in Manhattan, it was extremely difficult and took 12 years. In Trinidad, it took 4 years. And we've worked a lot in Illinois, in Elgin, Illinois, and Waukegan, Illinois, and we have also a couple of projects in Chicago. But we love working in communities the size of Springfield. There's something kind of magical about communities who are in that small to mid-size, just over 100,000. There's something really magical there because you can get all the decision makers also in the room at the same time, right? And there's land costs and building costs that are less expensive, but also there's a lot of opportunities and the community really needs to think about creative ways of occupying these buildings and bringing more vibrancy. And so in terms of clustering, artists and arts activity begets other artists and arts activity, and artists and creatives want to cluster near each other. And most of the projects that we do have anywhere between 30 and 100 units of affordable live workspace for creatives. And then on the ground floor, or sometimes on the first and second level, organization space. So nonprofits, creative businesses, et cetera. So it's a great mix. And when you have a density of artists in a place, we know from the economic impact studies that we've done that artists tend to be more successful in terms of being able to pursue their livelihood and make their money from their creative pursuits. So that's a really important point too, is that when artists come into these projects, they tend to make a lesser amount from their creative pursuits and hold down 1, 2, sometimes 3 other jobs. Once they're in these supportive environments where they don't have to worry about their rents going up and where they're surrounded by people with like minds and wanting to share and collaborate, they are able to make more of their income from their art and really pursue that as a career. A lot of people think that that's a side thing, but no, many artists would want it to be their main thing, but just don't always have the kind of space or situation that can allow them to flourish and grow and make the majority of their income from their art. So an artist will pay for space if it's affordable over other things, and they will sacrifice sometimes because space is so important to the creation of their work. And we can say that now that through the pandemic, and we have thousands of units of live workspace, we have 54 projects in 23 states. And those artists have been very stable in terms of being able to pay their rent through the pandemic and have prioritized that. So it's really interesting to see because we had no idea. We were fearful that the vacancy rate would go way up, but it hasn't. On the commercial side or the non-residential side, it's been a little softer, but on the residential side, artists are very passionate about being in those spaces and also giving back to the community. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in Springfield. I know that you have some underutilized buildings downtown. I'm sure there's opportunities in the neighborhoods as well. I want to turn it over to Anna for a second, though, to add another dimension. So Anna, if you're still there.
Yes, I'm still here. My internet is a little unstable, so flag me down. Just as I work from more the side of the nonprofit organizations or the businesses that are occupying these spaces, I can underline Wendy's comment about how important the space is and how we're getting more creative and across the country getting more creative about use of space. And just to talk about I think there was a question that came up about how our organizations have been working with BIPOC communities and BIPOC-led organizations, especially in the past year. But it's a part of Artspace's commitment over the years has been to partner with cultural communities and culturally relevant spaces to make sure that the voices of the communities are really being told through the whole process of a mixed use project, but also represented in the mixed use in the commercial spaces. So the work that I do on the technical assistance side and training really focuses on working with organizations that are led by and are serving communities that are usually underrepresented, and figuring out ways to find more access to these resources, even finding out what is available, finding access to brokers or finding access to funding to get these spaces together. Sometimes it is just as simple as a connection to a banker or an introduction to a broker. Other times it is kind of taking a broader look at what is the fabric of the community and how do we make sure that the spaces that are being built truly are welcoming to everyone, and also have a very specific impetus and are leading with the idea that these are going to be culturally diverse spaces and not just an afterthought.
Thanks, Anna. And Wendy, we did have a specific question come in about how Artspace provides or how Artspace funds these projects, basically. So can you talk briefly about sort of the complicated capital stack that goes into these projects, and then what management looks like from your perspective?
Sure. So almost all of the projects have an allocation of low-income housing tax credits, which is a federal resource that comes through your state. And that is a resource that takes up about 50 to 80% of the equity in these projects. And then we use home funds and other programs that are specifically for affordable housing. There'll be a little bit of traditional debt from a bank, and then philanthropy usually covers 10 to 15% of the total capital costs. So it's usually 10 to 12 sources that are part of the mix. It's a little complicated, but we figured out a way to make it all work. And then in terms of management, we hire a local property management company and they manage the building, and then we have asset managers who oversee them. So that's kind of the structure of it, and that's a really high level
Yes.
101.
Yes, because I can say, having been through the process with you guys, that figuring out that capital stack is it takes a while, but you guys have gotten very good at it. Okay, thank you so much, Wendy and Anna. We'll continue the conversation on. I want to jump over to Mike. So Mike, obviously one of the most incredible things about Springfield is all of the wonderful cultural and historical assets that exist and the wonderful facilities that are there. And I think really bolstering that cultural offer came through the Next 10 website as people were submitting ideas. Can you talk a little bit about, from your expertise and experience, consideration for how you really take all these wonderful offers and storylines that Springfield has? How do you unite them? How do you enhance them? And how do we think about programming in new and different ways, both post-pandemic, but also for newer, maybe younger emerging audiences, to make sure that there's something for everyone in Springfield when they come to visit?
Great. Thanks, Jamie. And I probably want to start with piggybacking off of a couple words that Justin was using here, critical mass and gathering place. I think the communities that we've worked with that have had a lot of success using culture and the arts have had enough critical mass to really make it work. And I think that, Springfield, has the bones of exactly that and the framework for all that. But I also want to, as we think about culture, and we're obviously a museum-based company, but, the museum is kind of the education and learning portion of a culture. We definitely think that there is story-based entertainment that comes through in live events and some of the virtual reality things that we're doing. And then a lot of what we'll call themed food and beverage, themed retail, even creative space-making places for shopping. We really think of all of that as culture and all of that coming together. And I think when people think about it differently, and again, we're a museum company, so we think about all the different museums, but there's a lot more to it that has to be threaded together. And I think that's, one of the things that I think has come out of COVID is the use of the digital platform, the use of technology has really been enhanced, mainly because it had to be for a lot of the museum partners we work with. But what it has allowed then is for what we hope to have is much more of breadcrumbs in the community, walking tours, but they're all digitally connected, so there's all a significant number of our partners are creating, either customized apps or even some national type of apps that are all coming together. So how do you connect the dots from this historic place to that historic place in a way that is, again, I'm going to use Justin's word, a gathering place. So you don't have to get the car and drive here or drive there. How do you connect the dots in a way that makes it easy and friendly for a community to come together? And I think that's one of the positive things coming out of COVID. And frankly, it's one of the things that I think even pre-COVID we saw. So, we've been involved in a lot of great projects in a lot of different communities. And I'll use one example was, and people don't think of Washington, D.C. as, down and, and out. But when we did the initial Spy Museum back in the late 1990s, we were in the middle of a Penn Quarter. The Penn Quarter was, frankly, a very scary area at the time. It was guns and drugs, and it was really bad. The Spy Museum was that with the Verizon Center were the two main assets that the city used to redevelop that area. And we were part of the planning team that worked with a couple of local developers that they developed the story of themed restaurants, the story of live entertainment, the story of different things outside of the Spy Museum, outside of the restaurant or the Verizon Center that really came together. And I think, thinking about that and thinking about each of your assets as a storytelling opportunity, again, how we think about culture is different, but I mean, it could be different, but I think everything could be a cultural asset along the way. And then having again, I keep stealing Justin's words, but it's so critically important to have a public-private partnership. Again, I'm going to use DC. We did the initial tax increment financing deal ever in the District of Columbia for the Spy Museum. And that was a new thing. We had to negotiate with the district CFO office, but they then were able to leverage that into future TIF deals for other arts and culture, because that's the only way some of this stuff can get done. The reality of it is, a lot of the things we're talking about need capital infusion. The government's going to benefit from in the long haul. So that's an investment that they have to be willing to make. And I think the communities we've worked with are willing to make that public-private investment. And then the private developers have to be able to step up and take some of that risk too, looking, long haul on what can happen. So, I think, again, using COVID as the reason, I'm going back to, how do you connect all these? I think, you connect them through the right public partnership at a bid or a something else level. And then from use of technology and other assets, continue to make sure these breadcrumbs are spread throughout this entire kind of walkable space.
Thank you, Mike. We've had a specific question come in, I think sort of about what you do, what your organization does, and what your role is. The question that's come in is, obviously Springfield, in addition to being home to Lincoln, was the launching point for President Obama's presidential campaign. And so the question is, if the community were interested in developing some sort of experience memorializing Obama and his formative years in office, is that the type of thing where you come into a community and you can help develop that and identify how it turns into something? Is that the sort of work you do?
We do. And we do a couple of different things, but probably on something like that, we develop, I'll call it a mini master plan, or it can be a broader master plan. But a lot of times we work with communities, like Jamie, using you as an example, we work with you and you'd be developing multi-block area or even larger of a community. And we'd come in and help in a little bit more narrow focus of that development. And let's just, so we would help put a master plan together around that smaller piece, but working with the community on their larger picture. So making sure that our goals and objectives are matched in some cases. And then while we may focus on a specific area, we make sure that, again, we use breadcrumbs all the time. There are breadcrumbs around that development that are linking. And then our firm, in the development of a master plan, we try to think left brain and right brain along the way. So what is this guest experience going to be? It's kind of the right brain side. And then my team, we really look on what does that business model look like? What's the capital structure? What's the operating model? How is it long-term financially sustainable? And so we kind of bring those two together by the end of our master planning process.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to move on to Jacob, sort of bookending this first round of questions with local perspective, and also your journey since leaving Springfield and the work that you've done. Several people have touched on the importance of performance and activation as a key driver of the creative economy, multicultural, all ages, new experiences. Talk a little bit about that and what you see as the opportunity for a city like Springfield to draw on local, but also national or international talent to really activate the community.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a ton of opportunity in Springfield, particularly with venues. And I appreciate the sort of question because I started as a performer and then obviously waited tables and worked for Tom Colicchio and some really well-known chefs, but that was like at the start of the sort of culinary movement or the culinary arts that are so celebrated now. And kind of by being that singing waiter, I found myself managing a venue that was a supper club for Broadway performers. And at the time I didn't feel like, I thought I would lose my creativity by managing a restaurant. But I thought I'd try this restaurant out, which had Broadway performers every night. And I thought, oh, well, I know a lot of the performers, and they were having trouble filling the calendar. 7 nights a week is a lot to activate. And when they realized that I knew a lot of the performers, they started leaning on me to program. And that's when I really found sort of where I live now. I got that same flutter that I got being on stage, putting people on stage who have fought so hard to be on stage in New York and that sort of thing. So I started producing, in different pockets in Manhattan that needed a bit more activation. A hotel property hired me on 42nd Street. They had a dead nightclub, but it was on 42nd Street. So before it turned into a nightclub at 11, we had an off-Broadway show running there. And and then like looking at the hotel and knowing like Lady Gaga's coming to town, and doing doing her 8 nights at Roseland before it closed, but she had this museum exhibit. And can you bring that into the hotel? And we partnered with her, and being really strategic about site activations, um, and by activating that hotel space with a lot of her museum pieces, she obviously shows up. And all of that started very small. And I think you could really activate Springfield in a similar way. It's, yes, you love to see these headlining acts show up into town, but like, how do you foster that? You have the Dana Thomas House, which you have so much history there. Lincoln's Home, obviously, Route 66, and finding those routed, they call them routed veils with agents. You have St. Louis 90 minutes away, you have Chicago and everything going on there. And I imagine that with COVID, those radius clauses will kind of ease up, or there'll be a bit more room for negotiation, and on a performer's night off, while Hamilton's sitting down in St. Louis or Chicago, can you call them up and have them pop down on their dark night on Monday and do a concert in front of the Capitol, things like that. Just really kind of, thinking big, but also thinking locally, and making sure that when you're programming talent, I always consider like where I'm coming from with these sorts of things. And when I book an artist, I make sure, 90% of the time, that if they are coming to sort of do like a luxury event in Napa, a private dinner, they also commit to going into a school and giving a master class or talking to the students and finding them a way to include the entire community. We had Campai Segundo in Napa, and that was like, it's part of Buena Vista Social Club was the sort of core of the group. And it was a very expensive, we got a lot of, philanthropic, donations toward that. But then they went to the Boys and Girls Club the next day and did a free concert for about 600 kids that would never have experienced. And the kids were on stage. And I mean, it's just like finding those ways to weave and create the community opportunity, so whether or not you have the large donors or those who are a little more in need of that, those sort of free concert experiences, kind of creating those.
Jacob, we've had a specific question come in for you, just adding on to what you've been talking about with sort of being in the travel patterns of artists. So the question is, if we are within the travel patterns of artists, what are we lacking, or what concrete steps do we need to take to attract those traveling artists to Springfield?
I may be predating even myself, or dating myself and predating myself. I kind of think I have a lot of brothers and sisters, and I remember some of the older ones going to see like the Van Halens and Kiss and these concerts at the Armory that Len Trumper, who was a local promoter, would produce. And he was, sort of like the Billy Graham Presents of the local area. And I think coming out of the COVID situation, I really feel for what Sheila was saying earlier, because when Broadway closed and California shut down, all of my work halted since March. And not only am I an employee, I am an employer of a lot of these artists. And I think of in Napa Valley, which I think Springfield could look to a bit. It's about 100,000 people. They have this huge wine market, huge tourism for that. The downtown dies. They couldn't sustain a city winery. They couldn't sustain Blue Notes was really struggling before the pandemic. And I think, with coming out of COVID, I think those opportunities for you to hook up with venues like a Ravinia or St. Louis Muni, I would look more toward these like people, instead of a venue in Springfield hiring a third party necessarily to program. You know, I call on somebody, you know, called agents directly and, you know, try to find that connection to start creating your own relationships with agents. I think they'll be looking for the bookings and shoot, I lost my train of thought with it, but it'll come back to me. But I do think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to put out a question targeted, I think, primarily first to Justin, Wendy, and Mike from kind of all of your diverse perspectives. And Justin, we'll start with you, but Wendy and Mike, feel free to kind of jump in too as well. So in the middle of the pandemic, I believe it was Business Insider ranked Springfield as the best city to live in America post-pandemic. They talked about the affordability and the opportunity for cities, you know, that are the size of Springfield, located where Springfield is, to become a place where people want to live, and knowing they can work remotely, knowing they can create there. Justin, you kind of hit on some of these points when you were initially talking. So there is an opportunity, I think, certainly to let the creative economy be a key driver. But I think there's also a question about how can that creative economy also bolster other economies. So can maybe, you know, starting with Justin, you talk a little bit about how artists have transformed other cities and how and the lure of development and investment that can result when artists take the lead.
Yeah, of course. I think it's a great question. And, you know, I'll start by saying I think creatives are just more sensitive to what everyone wants. They often signify kind of where societal values are headed. And they're the vanguard oftentimes. And you are seeing creatives choosing kind of neighborhoods that ring the urban core now, as opposed to wanting to be directly in the urban core in larger cities. And in towns that are more small and mid-sized, kind of like Wendy talked about earlier, there's something really special there. So, you know, the path for kind of how attracting creatives turns into a robust economy, or how that can influence economic development, you know, I think is a bit of a head scratcher for a lot of folks. We have had the benefit of seeing it kind of in real time over the last 15 years in River North. And really the progression has kind of been like this. Started with the existing assets, and artists identified those, to be honest, really on their own. They identified those as those warehouses, those commercial spaces, this kind of overlooked neighborhood as a place that they wanted to be. And Mike kind of touched on this, but what you really start to see, or what we saw in the progression from there, was as the sort of like traditional creatives inhabited those spaces, the very next step was that you started to see artisans start to kind of come in behind them. So, you know, there's a very specific coffee shop that opened up called Crema that anybody in Denver knows. That was like the place where then all of the artists were there every morning. They all got their coffee there. They all got to know each other. But you know, I mean, that was a business, and that business was ultimately successful because there was this little critical mass of artists who were already living there that were supporting them. And then sort of after, you know, a handful of those artisans came in, alongside that, there were a couple of developers, we being one of them, that were actively sort of working in other pockets of the neighborhood to create intentional space that was creative. And so then what you started to see is really kind of the office crowd, the business crowd was the next for us. And that might seem a little bit out of sequence from the traditional sort of progression for how this works, but it's because it was a lot of more new economy firms, and they recognized that the quality of life that they wanted to be able to utilize to offer to the best possible talent as employees was this space where you had creatives and artisans kind of already existing, and an interesting built environment. And so then, you know, quickly behind that followed residential. So then apartment developers started to come in to provide space because people don't want to travel anymore to work to the degree that they don't have to. And so then you started to get this really nice ecosystem between the artists who are still actively working, the office, and then retail started to come up because you started to see a critical mass of people living and working in the neighborhood. So this ecosystem kind of developed. And then on a parallel track to that, and not to minimize the role of both the city and the kind of community representation through the River North Art District. The Art District did things like create connections between all of these different groups. So developers would go to the Art District and say, I want a mural in my lobby. The Art District would bring in, a couple of artists, the developers would interview them, and all of a sudden you've got dollars flowing kind of laterally as well between these different groups that help sustain the arts as the neighborhood continues to sort of build around what they originally created. A key part of this too was the fact that the city in 2010 had changed the zoning really citywide and put the most flexible zoning in this part of the city. So all of these parcels, for the most part, were zoned either industrial or commercial mixed use, which in Denver, when you scratch below the surface of what that means, it basically means you can build anything. And so from the developer's standpoint, it's very attractive because you can come in and figure out what is going to be the best sort of, you can mix uses, you can not mix uses. It just provides a lot of flexibility for everyone to kind of create the environment that makes the most sense for them. The next iteration for us, of course, is issues of things getting too expensive for the artists. And this is something that, Wendy works on every day. And so I think there's another step, and there's of course going to be further steps after that we have to try to figure out how to make sure that the creative economy remains vibrant in the place that it built. But I talked about partnerships a little bit earlier, and I think that's where people have to be talking to each other. You need to have the head of economic development talking to the head of the neighborhood association, talking to a couple of key developers, bringing in the artists, bringing in a couple of small retailers. What do you need as far as, do you need better sidewalks? Do you need a bike lane? Can we bring TIF in here? Is that going to help a developer be able to mitigate just enough risk to really recognize the opportunity? So that's the progression we saw in Denver. I think it's replicable in a lot of parts of the country, and Springfield is no exception to that.
Yeah, Wendy, Mike.
Well, I was going to jump in there with the Soho effect because that it's very real, and artists live in the world of displacement where they are on the vanguard and they make these places desirable for others, and then they're often displaced. And so that's been the focus of Artspace's work through the decades, is to try to stop that cycle of displacement for as many artists as possible. But we alone can't do that. It's really city policy and other things that have to join with that to be able to do that well and over the long term, because artists will definitely make area property values rise. It's just what happens. And then they get displaced. And so if a community or a city values artists, you need to figure out what policies you want to have in place and what programs you want to have in place to help stop that cycle, because artists and creatives are some of the most valuable members of your society, and they bring and attract others that don't even think about the arts necessarily, but it's what tricks people into wanting to become part of a community, even if they don't know that's why. So go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Wendy. I think the only other thing I'd add, I think Wendy and Justin got a lot of, but I think we all got, the creative economy is largely a service-based economy. And I think if we start with that, we then have to understand each jurisdiction's tax base. How do they generate tax off of a service-based economy? Because then that can be leveraged into, again, public-private partnerships. How ultimately does the city get repaid for that has to be part of this whole thing. So I agree with, the progression on, it starts with the artists and then artisans come in and then cultural, but a lot of that has to be making sure that the tax base of the jurisdictions match up with that, or could be tweaked for that. Because then I do think things then follow along with that. The construction side for offices or renovation, residential, whatever, that becomes more of this manufacturing economy after the fact. So I think thinking about that on the front end and just recognizing that the creative economy is a different kind of economy than we've seen. It has to just be notified on the front end is probably the only other thing I'd add to the conversation.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to throw out a couple more questions for you three, and there I'm going to weave together a couple questions that have come in. First, I think a specific question about what has been or what should be the role of a city planner in developing a successful arts and culture district. You've all sort of talked about planning and policy. So what is the role of planning in that? And from a city's perspective, you know, what are all those things from, you know, zoning and whatever that you need to think about? And I'll just weave, not directly related, but sort of along the same lines, a question specifically to Springfield. Obviously, we've talked about the Soho effect and how gentrification can push artists out. In the moment, Springfield has so much affordable housing that it's actually fairly affordable for artists to be there. They may not necessarily need significant subsidized housing, but what are other programs or projects or initiatives that can happen to fund and bolster the artist community to allow them to do and expand their work? And so I'll put those two kind of things from planning to actual, what are other things outside building space actually in Springfield at the moment that can start to really catalyze a creative economy in Springfield?
I love the one about planning because some smart cities across the United States have paired planners with artists. And this started in St. Paul, Minnesota, but it's been replicated in many cities across the United States. And it's not to think about public art, it's to think about everything. It's to think about streetscape and density and comp plans and just get in there and contribute their creative minds into the process. So that's one idea. Another organization that I would point to for some great examples is Tacoma Spaceworks. So Tacoma, which is near Seattle, you know, it's the more industrial city. It's sort of the city that says, hey, I'm here too, but doesn't get as much attention as Seattle. And they have this great program called Tacoma Spaceworks, and it came out of the city. And they're pairing artists and businesses with vacant spaces and then providing them technical assistance to be successful in launching their business operation over the first 3 years and providing free space through negotiations with landlords that own the buildings. So that's a very creative way of focusing on underutilized spaces. And I think your downtown has been really, Springfield downtown has really been impacted by the state workers leaving. Is that right? And so I think that that's something that's really on your mind. And I think looking at that program would be interesting for you all.
I'll add a couple things there. I think when planners, generally speaking, when planners listen to the community, there's a better outcome. I think that's pretty widely understood. But some of the ways that we've seen that be successful is as a community starts to self-mobilize a little bit and come up with some planning ideas, I think planners need to really key into that because those are the boots on the ground. So, you know, for Springfield, if there becomes a nexus of artists, to Wendy's point, really connecting those folks directly to the planners and saying, what do you need to thrive in this space? And oftentimes that does look like, well, you know, we need to be able to get ourselves here more easily. We need other transportation options. We need, you know, here's some ideas for landscaping. I think just really connecting the community, and especially if the community starts to kind of identify leaders within itself to speak on behalf of the arts community. I think flexibility, I mentioned it earlier, is just critical. Their policy can be such a restriction to the flourishing of creatives. I think creatives know what they know is how to create. And so I think in some ways we kind of got to get out of the way a little bit. And so that's I think always a key lesson for planners is, you know, Jane Jacobs was the one who really broke down the idea and said planning is not like architecture. This is not a top-down design exercise. This is recognizing the cities are totally organic, and you need to understand that they ebb and flow and change, and it's a collective decision-making process. And so it's more about being quiet and paying attention to what's happening, and then finding ways to augment that sort of creative growth.
And James, what the second question you said was that there's enough affordable housing. What were they looking for? I'm sorry, can you repeat the second question?
Yeah, just the comment that at the moment, anyway, Springfield has quite affordable housing. So different than maybe a New York or even a Denver where, you know, subsidizing artist housing to keep them there is important. So, but the bigger question is what are programs or initiatives or policy moves or whatever, what are other things that can be done to really help grow an artist's work or the creative economy?
Yeah, well, and the other thing I guess I'd throw in, you know, in some of the mature cities we work with, and we're doing something in San Diego right now. So I know the size is very different, but you know, mature downtown, successful downtown. But part of their development now are mandating X amount of square feet for cultural and arts. But it's a very, on purpose, a very broad-based, flexible use of that. And so, you know, we're gonna, you know, we're working on a museum project that will probably be, call it 60,000 square feet in a probably 400,000 square foot facility, just to give kind of ratios. But that 60,000 square feet has to be subsidized significantly from the developer as part of that. And so I don't know if that answers it. You know, obviously it's not that size and scope that you need there, but there could be things like that from a policy standpoint that over time, if a new development is taking place, you know, X number of square feet can be used for some of these artists in different ways. And I think that's something that, and I frankly, in some of the ones we've worked with in the past, they've done a lot of that as well. And this is, we keep saying the same thing, I think, public-private partnership. There has to be a lot of discussion around this, making sure it fits within the overall program of the district or the area, but then making sure that that happens so that you truly do weave in the arts with the other opportunities from a development standpoint.
Great, thank you so much.
Amy, can I
All
throw
right.
in a couple others?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think Denver has and you might have talked about this previously, but the 1% for arts. So some really kind of more tactical tools as public funding is expended, setting aside a percentage of that is just going to go directly towards the arts to create kind of an ongoing funding stream or revenue stream there. Another one is if there's an appetite to relook at zoning, requiring that there be some mixture of uses. And what that tends to do is lock in commercial space that initially and hopefully for some time is really affordable for artists. And so I think those are two very specific ways that Denver has been successful in encouraging creativity.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that. You know, I know St. Louis and Cleveland, Ohio, both have similar annual funding for cultural institutions and make sure that they have that as part of their tax base again. And so those are things that from a policy standpoint that could be added.
I just want to jump in and add from, you know, in addition to the, you know, the top down, the policy level and getting artists involved, I think it kind of from that bottom up again, supporting the artists and arts organizations so that they're making the most healthy and sustainable choices about their own space, if that's it, or organization. I know in many cities that we've worked in, I'm not sure about Springfield, but the business development programs or technical assistance programs are wonderful for kind of businesses, commercial businesses, but nonprofits and creative organizations sometimes don't quite fit into that framework. So thinking about ways to kind of support artists and arts businesses as businesses themselves, because even an individual artist is a cottage industry, it is a business, but sometimes existing programs don't necessarily fit their needs.
Excellent, thank you. All right, I want to come back to Sheila and Jacob again to sort of bring this home to Springfield. We've heard a lot of great stuff over the last hour or so. And so I want to talk a little bit about the specific challenges and opportunities to creative economy transformation in Springfield. So we have specifically heard things around planning. What do we have, you know, from the planning perspective, both from how we allow buildings to be developed or land to be used to a larger strategy for the creative economy. We've heard about funding, and Jacob, there was a specific question to your point about, you know, sort of outreaching to talent to bring them in. What does that look like from a funding perspective? 1% for arts types programs, things that are really dedicated to building the creative economy. So could you both jump in and touch a little bit on some specific things that you see as challenges that could be overcome, that we could work on, certainly as part of the Next 10, and opportunities that could really be bolstered in Springfield?
Jacob, you start.
Okay. I think it's sort of an ongoing question, obviously, about Springfield is like, how do you anchor downtown? Like, how do you get that to be the anchor again for the community? I would encourage people to really invest a lot local. I mean, you have some great things in the farmers market. You know, are there ways weave the like more arts and experiences to that? I imagine Kids will be reopening after the COVID restrictions. That's right by there. So I remember when they opened, I got sort of on the pro bono side. I was just talking to the head of the Ravinia Festival, and they were looking for places for their kids' jazz ensemble to play. And they sent them down to the Kidseum on a day where they were having the farmers market. And you know, exploring the Enos Park area, which I think is offering incentives for artists or anybody to move in. It's a great neighborhood. And then you creep up there and you have how I know Sheila, my high school, my old alma mater and junior college that I went to is just sitting vacant, and it is an amazing property. You know, that is the much bigger picture when a developer, you know, might come in and turn that into something. But, you know, don't shy away from, you know, dreaming that way or thinking that way, and obviously start trying to come up with ways like how you would fund something like that. But look, like I started in New York using like $400 a week to like pay an artist to come in. I started one artist a week, and I worked with a restaurant that I knew would give me free space because I would bring in business for them. And just partnering with seeing who you could partner with and building off of that. And sort of going back to the thought I lost earlier, Napa Valley, which is about 100,000 people, started with they have this festival, Bottle Rock. And it's not just a baby Coachella. I mean, they have major headliners, and a local started that event. It was kind of a mess in the beginning, and then another local took it over the following year. And you have, I mean, not only do you have Bruno Mars and Neil Young and, you know, major headlining, Miley Cyrus was supposed to headline this year, The Killers. You have these headlining acts, but they also during the day would have the Napa Symphony, and all the food vendors were local and the wineries were local. I produced Taste of Napa in Napa, and it was a similar concept. I brought in all the wineries, culinary demos, but then you'd feature artists, local and a headlining act. And maybe you start that with just like, you know, on the Y block, or, you know, some space that's not activated, you know, over by the Hoagland Center. Use the Hoagland Center. You have the art gallery right there. Like, how many different mediums can you like pull in, start small, and then just start pushing out from there? And because that's also going to broaden your audience.
Yes, good. The idea of starting small and letting it build from there, and realizing the cause and effect. The Old Capitol Farmers Market happens on Adams Street between 2nd and 3rd, spring, summer, and fall. A lively scene. It became the gathering space for many sectors of the community. And the Kidseum is located on that block. And across from the Kidseum is a longtime cafe. And down next to that cafe, there's a tea shop. And there's a clothing imprinting business, and there's a women's clothing store, and something on the corner is being developed through crowdfunding. And it's taking what had a lot of empty buildings, the farmers market, which is over 20 years old, well-run, bringing lots of local farmers together, improving that sector of our economy, including crafters and artisans in sales spaces at the market, hiring musicians to play at the market, encouraging more people to gather when we're outside the pandemic. It all happens. It all comes out of that. Vendors themselves learn how to run a business and creatively then start a brick and mortar shop. So it is happening, and it's with city investment. It is with public and private partnerships, and it has worked. In downtown Springfield, we have some wonderful sculptures, and there's an app on poles around downtown, the Aware app. Smartphones key into that as place finding, and that could be a tool used to guide people to the art alley and the public art and sculptures. We do have galleries downtown. Store windows themselves are artistic and can be highlighted. The city has invested money in some streetscaping, and now that outdoor dining became something we invested in the spring and summer, there's a further move toward pocket parks, and that slows traffic. And when traffic slows, people stop and shop. The Enos Park neighborhood that Jacob mentioned, and is one in which I live, we have a sculpture park, a community garden that has performances by poets and storytellers. We host an exhibit out of Chicago called the Terrain Biennial that encourages dozens, scores of people to drive through our neighborhood and look at those installations that are partnerships between artists and homeowners. And the Springfield Art Association has artist residencies year round. You live in the neighborhood, you do some work at the Art Association, and you leave something for that neighborhood. So these are all things that have gained traction and can be built upon to further build the creative economy of Springfield. I'm excited about it.
Thank you so much. I just want to note we have about 10 minutes left, and so please keep sending in your questions. I am going to dive into a few more that have come in from our viewers as well. I want to talk, we've got a specific question around how we can fund a thriving arts and culture district or economy specifically. And I know that you all have talked about things like the 1% for arts and sort of set asides for that. So I will open it up to the group about that. And Justin, maybe you can also speak specifically to something like RiNo and kind of the creative district movement in Colorado that has really been able to drive not just RiNo, but Trinidad and multiple other districts across the state really drive their creative economies.
Yeah, I think, to the degree that there's creative funding for creatives through the state, if that can be identified, that's certainly a great starting point. Another one that we had great success with in RiNo was forming a business improvement district. And business improvement districts, they tend to focus, they've kind of historically been used for things like, trash removal, security, those kind of things. We reimagined, working closely with Jamie, kind of what a business improvement district could be, and really ultimately used it to fund culture and not just culture, but also some of the things that allowed culture to exist. So funding some different programs that sort of benefited the broader social fabric. The business improvement district tool is great because it's quasi-governmental. It's ultimately the board represents the community itself, and it provides taxing authority. And so to the degree that the community identifies a business improvement district as a literal way to pull in some dollars and have those go directly towards the arts, that can be written into the bid's sort of plan from the outset. So just a couple of ways. And then I think I brought this up earlier, but tax increment financing has had a lot to do with the success of several Denver neighborhoods in providing that incentive for developers to come in and oftentimes create the sort of first set of retail or restaurant and bar businesses, which to Mike's point, the creative economy is a service economy. And, the people who are working at those bars and restaurants, a lot of them are creatives creating in that community. So it provides kind of on the market side, a base for those creatives to be able to work and thrive there. So just a couple of the tools that we've used locally.
Yeah, the only thing I'd couple more to add, I think on the tax increment financing, making it sales tax, not just property tax, is kind of a key point to that. I think Justin probably assumed that, but the other one that we've used recently in Colorado, actually, Colorado has a tourism act that we were able to get some significant funding for a project. Anything net new into your, in this case, state, but maybe there's something similar locally that could be developed where it's, starting to bring in people from out of town and using that as a leverage into financing projects and getting some capital infusion into different developments and something else to consider.
There was a very specific question that has come in about 1% for arts. I'm not sure if anybody on this panel can directly answer or maybe generally share even. The question is about what is a 1% for arts program or similar arts funding, what does it generate on a per capita basis? Does anybody have any insight into that?
Oh gosh.
I mean, I know in Colorado, or in Denver, excuse me, the 1% for arts is solely on public funded projects. So it's 1% of any publicly subsidized infrastructure project that goes in that I think is over $1 million. Anything over $1 million, that 1% kicks in. I do know that there are other communities. I think San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken, has a 1% for arts, at least in part of the community, that is includes private development as well. That's something we had talked about in Denver, RiNo at one point, in which that also goes into a pot. But
Jamie, we have that in the state of Illinois for Illinois owned properties, state of Illinois owned properties.
Okay. All right. Any other comments just on funding? I also want to ask generally, again, just sort of open it up to the entire panel. There was a question that came in about the role of bringing educational institutions in fostering not only art, but entrepreneurship among creatives and how to really build creative economy through education. So I just wanted to put that out there and get any thoughts or insight on that from the panelists.
I could revisit what I was saying earlier, which is whenever I produce content, try to, when you're exploring artists or people you are bringing in for performances, open that discussion up to whether or not they would be willing to engage in that community, that sector, the academic side of things. I love, bringing that component to any sort of producing I do.
And most artists are also teachers. So there is that piece too, which draws in the educational organizations. They may not lead with that, but it's pretty common.
The Springfield Area Arts Council specifically will fund artists and performers visit to schools. We pay the stipend and the school determines the kind of programming that best fits and will match them up. So that is something locally. Statewide, I'm very proud that Illinois is the first state in the country that has mandated through the State Board of Education an arts indicator as a measure of school quality. And that means that public schools will have to consider their arts offerings as they're budgeting and designing curriculum so that they can meet that indicator. That in turn produces more producers and consumers of art as they move forward in their lives.
Great, thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and to our panelists, I know we didn't get through all of the questions we had discussed, but I think in order to wrap it up and give everybody a chance to share some final comments, we'll go around the room, and I'd love for you, we've covered a lot of territory and talked about a lot of different things. Obviously, you don't all know or have been to Springfield, but I think through these conversations, you've gotten some insight into what's happening there and the opportunity. So based upon your experience and expertise, I'd just love to hear what are the next steps, 1 to 2 things you would suggest to the community as a way to kind of build on what they have and take things forward. And I'll start with Justin.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, what needs to happen seems like it's underway. There needs to be a vision. There needs to be a collective vision. And so I think, with the next 10, really sort of fleshing out what that is and then coming up with sort of specific actions underneath that. I'll just go back to kind of where I started, which is identifying existing assets and leveraging those assets and not getting caught up in trying to come up with overly, technical solutions or trying to copy maybe what somebody else has done successfully, but looking internally. So I think between the great building stock, both commercial and residential, the proximity to major urban centers, the history, which is an inspiration in its own way, there's really a there in Springfield. And I think a lot of places, especially suburbs and larger cities that are going through a similar exercise, they don't have that there. They're having to create it. So I think really finding ways to maximize the value of what exists, which is physical space and kind of an inspirational built environment. There's probably a bit of a marketing effort that needs to take place to creatives. There's no substitute for targeted outreach and great photography on your existing building stock, and giving people the ability to imagine themselves in that space. So just a couple of thoughts.
Awesome, thank you. Wendy and Anna.
I think you have an amazing opportunity, building on what Justin says, to activate those vacant spaces on the ground floor of these buildings and have artists, musicians, all kinds of artists occupy those spaces and bring people in to the extent that you can do that safely, and you will be able to, and the weather's going to get warmer. And finding diverse voices is super important. It's the 21st century, and our country has been woken up in a new way. And I think Springfield has a diverse population. I looked recently at your demographics, and having those faces and people that truly represent your citizenry and the neighborhoods there will be really important to do. So that's just two little tidbits. Anna, do you have anything else to add?
Well said. I'll pass the mic.
Great. Mike Devine, you are up.
Great, thanks. I think you have to have a sandwich. I think you have to have this top-down vision, but you have to have the ground up activation and start knocking and just start doing instead of planning. And I think, we're a planner. So I'm talking, I think you have to plan, but you have to get going, and you have to, through a vision or a master plan, start knocking out what you can to show that it can be done, it can be executed, and it really does get momentum. One developer, one asset, next developer, next asset. I think that's the one thing that these thriving communities, you got to get started, you got to plan, you got to have a vision, but you got to get started from the ground up as well. And that's so I'd encourage you, wherever, the sooner you can get started on implementation, the more momentum you're going to get and more buy-in you're going to get.
Awesome. Jacob. Oh, you're on mute.
First off, I think you guys have definitely taken that step with this Next 10 project. It was incredibly exciting to see. The important thing is just ask people, ask the questions. I've not been incredibly active this last year, and the phone rang and John called and yourself to ask if I would participate in something like that. I love Springfield. Um, I love Napa in New York. I have a passion for all three areas. I go to Springfield 4 times a year. I've only produced in 2 of those 3 cities. And it can be incredibly challenging to produce in Springfield. I've not yet done that. Sort of always been a dream of mine. And I think sort of related, unrelated, I think what's important, somebody was asked about the Obama, celebrating Obama's Springfield years, and if there's opportunity there. It's strange because politics are so divisive, yet that's like one of the things you could really celebrate. You have the link with everything we mentioned before, Route 66, Lincoln's home, you have the Capitol, you have all of these politicians coming to the area, like finding ways to celebrate that and putting politics aside to, focus on your strengths. I'm not a city planner. I'm not gonna pitch myself as one, but I plan events and I'm always a pro bono phone call away if anybody has any questions, and would be thrilled to help the hometown out.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacob. And Sheila, we'll give you the final word.
Jacob, maybe you and I could work together on programming something in a downtown spot, Bicentennial Plaza on the Jackson Street corridor. I have some ideas, and certainly the Y Block, where we have been, where the Arts Council has been working with other organizations on Levitt Amp Springfield, which we hope can be live and in that space this summer safely. Again, I want to give this broader perspective. Nationally, 82% of Americans believe that arts and culture are important to local businesses and to the economy. And 87% of Americans believe arts and culture are important to the quality of life. When we have that majority of people understanding the importance of arts and culture, and when we have people, I looked at the participant list and the names that appear there of Springfielders who are interested in this topic can really give momentum and motivation, the movers and the shakers, to this initiative. Again, it makes me optimistic. And so I think we have some great things on which we can build, and happily the Arts Council and other arts organizations in town, and there are many. Springfield supports arts and culture in ways that we don't see in some other Midwestern cities, and we can capitalize on that, I think. Jamie from Mason City nearby, Jamie grew up in northern Iowa, I discovered earlier in the week, and we share a fondness for Mason City, a small Midwestern city that really has used the arts as a driver of tourism and economic development. And there are case studies all over and experts already. Do we need this to come from a city level position that some Midwestern cities have, where the city actually funds someone working within that government structure to coordinate all these initiatives? Sure, that would be great. And that could come eventually if there ever is room found in a budget. Meanwhile, I think there's lots we can do and build on things where we've already been successful. Listen to the experts, listen to ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And thank you everybody for sticking with us for a few extra moments. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. I loved all of your perspectives, and what a great conversation on so many different parts of the creative economy. We appreciate your time today. John, I will turn it back over to you to wrap up.
Great. Thank you to everyone. This was an incredible panel. Thank you, Jamie, for doing an incredible job moderating once again. These extra series webinars were meant to really inspire and inform people. And I think we accomplished that today. I know I can't wait to go to one of Jacob Langfelder's produced performances here in Springfield coming soon, we hope, and hope Justin, Mike, Wendy, and all of you come to visit us here in the capital city very soon after we're all allowed to be around one another. So thank you all. Stay tuned for the next extra series. In the meantime, we're going to be hard at work on the next 10 ideas. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.